Here's a question I want you to sit with for the next few minutes, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why it is so hard to answer. The United States has already dropped its most powerful conventional bomb on Iran once. And by every account we have, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Now there is a second target on the table, one that a growing number of independent experts believe may actually be too deep for that same bomb to reach. So what happens next if the biggest weapon in the American arsenal is not big enough for the job it is being asked to do? Stick around, because that question is a lot more interesting, and I mean a lot more important than it sounds. And the answer touches everything from tunnel geology to how a president chooses to talk about a target before it has even been hit. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown airliners for a long time, the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. I spend my time breaking down military aviation stories like this one, using real reporting and technical documents instead of just repeating whatever headline is trending. And today's story honestly has one of the most interesting technical puzzles I've covered in a while. So let's get into the real details, starting with what has already happened before we get to the part that is still truly unresolved. The most powerful non-nuclear weapon in the American arsenal is called the GBU-57, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator. It is a 30,000 lb bomb, more than 20 ft long, and it does not work like most of what you picture when you think of a bomb. It is not made to explode on impact. It is made to bury itself first, punching through about 200 ft of earth, or around 60 feet of reinforced concrete, using nothing but a hardened steel casing and sheer falling weight. And only then does a smart fuse trigger the actual explosion from deep underground, where the blast does far more damage to a buried structure than the same explosive would do if it exploded on the surface. The fuse itself is genuinely clever. It can actually count the layers it passes through as it drills down, sensing when it has gone from solid rock into open space inside a tunnel or bunker. So the detonation happens exactly where it will do the most damage, instead of wherever the bomb happens to physically stop. There is exactly one aircraft on the planet that can carry it, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, because nothing else is big enough or stealthy enough to deliver a weapon that size into contested airspace and get back out again. This bomb has already been used against Iran once in a mission that basically wrote the playbook for everything that has happened since. In June of last year, 7 B-2 bombers flew all the way from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. It was a round trip of something like 12,000 to 14,000 miles and well over 30 hours in the air, with multiple aerial refuelings along the way, to strike Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear enrichment sites. Those were sites that had been seen as basically untouchable during an entire week of earlier Israeli strikes against Iran. 6 of those bombers dropped 12 total MOPs on Fordo, aimed at the facility's ventilation shafts, with each bomb digging deeper into the same impact point before the next one followed it down, essentially drilling a compound hole through solid rock one bomb at a time. A 7th bomber dropped 2 more on Natanz. That mission had a call sign, Operation Midnight Hammer, and it was the first time this weapon had ever been used in real combat after about 2 decades of development, built specifically to defeat exactly this kind of target. The program goes back to lessons learned from bomb damage assessments in the Iraq War, when the bunker busters available at the time simply were not penetrating deep enough against some fortified facilities. And it did not stop there. Earlier this year, once the broader war between the US, Israel, and Iran kicked off in February, this same weapon showed up again. This time it struck an underground Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters complex near Tehran in early April. The strike was ordered by the commander of U.S. Central Command in the middle of a search and rescue operation for a downed F-15 crew, specifically to take pressure off the rescue teams working on the ground. 2 B-2s flew that mission too, and by most reporting, the target was destroyed outright, with none of the lingering uncertainty that sometimes comes with a strike this deep underground. That same operation also included B-1 Lancer bombers dropping roughly 2,000 LB-class bombs separately, aimed at pushing Iranian ground forces away from the rescue site instead of hitting the underground complex itself. And that tells you something important about how these missions are actually planned in real life. The heaviest and most specialized weapon in the whole arsenal goes after the one target that truly needs it, while more common and more expendable munitions handle everything else happening around it at the same time. It is a division of labor that keeps the rarest asset focused on the exact job only it can do. So heading into this month, the pattern was already clear. When Iran builds something deep enough that nothing else can reach it, the US sends B-2s and MOPs, and so far, every single time, it has worked. Which brings us to the real reason I wanted to make this video, because that streak may be about to run into a problem it has never faced before. There is a site in Iran called Pickaxe Mountain, officially known as Kuakolan Gazla, sitting a little over a mile south of the Natanz nuclear complex in Isfahan province, tucked into the Zagros mountain range. It was not part of last year's Fordo and Natanz strike package. It has never been accessed by International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, which means there is no independent on-the-ground proof of what is actually inside. There is only outside analysis based on satellite images and inference. And those satellite images, reviewed by several outlets, including the Washington Post, show construction there has continued through this entire war. New security walls, reinforced tunnel entrances, fresh digging, heavy equipment still moving material as recently as this spring, even while the rest of the country was taking airstrikes on almost every other piece of nuclear infrastructure it has. Analysts believe Iran is using the site to expand its centrifuge assembly capacity, replacing capability that was damaged in earlier strikes at Natanz and elsewhere. And some experts have raised the possibility, without public confirmation, that Iran may have moved part of its stockpile of 60% enriched uranium there specifically because it is harder to reach than anywhere else in the country. If that is true, and again, nobody has confirmed it, it would make Pickaxe Mountain not just a construction project, but maybe the single most strategically important nuclear site Iran still has left standing. Here is the part that makes this truly different from every other target we have talked about so far. Trump named Pickaxe Mountain directly in a radio interview this week while talking about the possibility of what he called a nice big shot right in the front door. The interview was with a national radio host, and it came just hours after Trump had already announced the return of the naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, and while American forces were actively launching a new round of strikes elsewhere in the country. So this was not some casual comment made by itself. It landed in the middle of an already escalating week, squeezed between two other major military and economic pressure moves instead of standing alone. And almost right away, munitions experts pushed back on the idea. The tunnel complex under Pickaxe Mountain is estimated to sit somewhere between 260 and 330 FT underground, buried under granite that is much harder to penetrate than the softer rock and reinforced concrete found at Fordo. And some assessments put the effective burial depth closer to 2,000 EFT once you count the full geology of the mountain above the actual tunnel network. Compare that to the GBU-57's rated penetration of around 200 feet of reinforced concrete, and you can see exactly why analysts have spent years, long before this current war even started, describing this site as beyond the reach of even the most powerful conventional bunker buster America has. One analyst at the Open Nuclear Network put it about as clearly as I have seen anywhere. There's a real tension between maximalist promises to take out the mountain and the far more uncertain reality of what conventional weapons can actually achieve against it. He also pointed out a second, less discussed risk, that any strike attempt against a facility this sensitive could further weaken what little international oversight of Iran's nuclear program still exists, while at the same time raising the chances of wider regional escalation whether the strike actually works or not. And that is not some fringe opinion. It is close to the consensus view among people who have studied this exact site for years. It is not one outlier take from one skeptical analyst trying to get attention. Even the head of the Institute for Science and International Security, writing about Fordo years before this war began, said in a 2022 report that Fordo was already considered too deeply buried to easily destroy from the air. And by every estimate we have, Pickaxe Mountain sits even deeper than that, with harder rock and much less outside verification of what is actually down there in the first place. When several independent research groups, using different satellite feeds and different methods, keep landing on about the same depth estimate, that kind of overlap is usually a pretty strong sign that the number is close to right, even if nobody has had direct physical access to confirm it. And that is exactly the kind of independent agreement that makes a claim worth taking seriously instead of brushing it off as guesswork. So what actually happens if the order comes down to strike a target that may truly be beyond the reach of your best weapon? This is not a question military planners get to avoid. Someone has to decide, and soon, given how publicly this target has already been named, there are really only a couple of realistic paths, and I want to walk through both because I think this is where the story gets truly interesting, instead of just being another headline about a scary bomb. The first option is what munition specialists call a layered strike. That means dropping a second MOP into basically the same crater the first one just made, letting it drill farther down through the hole that has already been carved out before it detonates even deeper than the first bomb could manage by itself. Think of it less like one hammer blow and more like a series of hammer blows landing in the exact same spot, each one going a little farther than the last. This is not just theory. It is exactly what happened at Fordo last year, where 6 separate bombs were walked into the same 2 ventilation shafts in sequence, specifically to maximize total depth instead of spreading 12 bombs across 12 different impact points. The problem is precision. You need an extremely tight impact area between each bomb, close enough that the second one is basically falling down the tunnel the first one already dug. And every extra pass over the target is another period of exposure for B-2 crews flying one of the most closely watched and most heavily defended missions in the entire war. So it is not a simple fix. It is a truly higher risk tactic that only gets used when there is no other option. The second possibility is a lot less satisfying to talk about, which is that even a direct, well-executed strike might only partly damage what is under that mountain instead of destroying it outright. And Iran would then have both the reason and the excuse to rebuild deeper, faster, and with even more secrecy than before. And that raises a question I do not think gets asked enough in the coverage of this story. What happens politically and militarily if the strike does not fully succeed? Is that treated as enough disruption by itself, enough to claim a win and move toward negotiation? Or does it become the argument for building something even bigger than the GBU-57, a weapon that does not exist yet, specifically to finish the job the current one could not quite complete? There is also a quieter possibility worth naming, that a partial strike gets presented publicly as a full success no matter what the actual underground damage was, simply because there is no independent inspector access to prove otherwise. And that is exactly the kind of uncertainty that tends to fuel years of argument instead of cleanly settling anything, the way Fordo's true post-strike condition is still debated by outside analysts. More than a year later, I do not have a confident answer for you here, and I do not think anyone honestly does yet, but it is worth sitting with because this is a truly different kind of question from anything the earlier strikes in this war have forced onto the table. It is a question about the limits of what force alone can guarantee, not just whether force gets used at all. Let's talk about what it actually takes to fly one of these missions in the first place, because I think this gets lost in a lot of the coverage. Every single GBU-57 strike requires B-2s flying out of Missouri, which means round-trip missions of 30-plus hours in the air, multiple aerial refuelings, and a huge logistics chain of tankers supporting the route the whole way instead of launching from a base already somewhere in the region. The B-2 fleet itself is truly small, only a couple dozen airframes in total. It is the only aircraft on Earth stealthy enough and large enough to carry this weapon into heavily defended airspace and make it back out. And that stealth part is not just a side detail, it is the whole reason the platform was chosen for this weapon in the first place. A target this sensitive is going to be protected by layered air defenses, and a non-stealth aircraft simply would not survive the approach the way the B-2 is designed to. Compare that with more common weapons like the GBU-72, a 5,000 LB class bunker buster that has been used against Iranian coastal missile sites earlier this year, or the 2,000 LB GBU-31 used against ammunition depots, both of which can be carried by a much wider range of aircraft, F-15Es, B-1s, B-52s, without anything close to the same extreme mission profile or survivability need. So every time you hear about a GBU-57 specifically, you are looking at a completely different kind of operation than almost anything else happening in this war, and that scarcity is part of why the Pickaxe Mountain question matters so much. There just is not a deep bench of backup options sitting behind this one weapon. And there is not a second platform waiting in reserve if the B-2 fleet ever needs a break. That puts a huge amount of pressure on a very small number of crews and airframes every single time this specific weapon gets called into service. I want to point out something else too, because I think it matters if you want to understand why this target has created so much more public discussion than many of the other strikes I have covered lately. Naming a specific target out loud in a radio interview before anything has actually happened is itself a form of pressure. It puts Iran on notice and creates a reason for renewed negotiation before any bomb ever falls. That is a very different communication strategy from quietly building a target package and then carrying it out, and it comes with real trade-offs either way. But it also means that if a strike does eventually happen there and it does not fully work, that is now a public, specific claim that will be measured directly against the real outcome in a way most strikes in this war never have been. There is no walking back a promise about a nice big shot right in the front door if the front door turns out to be farther away than expected. Historically, many of these target sets only get confirmed after the fact, not put forward ahead of time as a threat. So whether this is a deliberate pressure tactic meant to push Iran back to the table, or just unusually open public talk in the moment, it is a truly different approach from what we have seen through the rest of this conflict. And I think that alone is worth watching closely over the next few weeks, because it changes the political stakes of the strike itself, not just the military ones. It also raises an interesting possibility that the goal here was never really to strike the mountain at all, but to use the threat of striking it as leverage, in which case success looks less like a bomb being dropped and more like a phone call between negotiators. That would be a much quieter and much less dramatic ending than anything the headlines this week have been suggesting. Now, before you take any of this as certain, I want to give you the same warning I try to build into every one of these breakdowns, because on a story like this, it honestly matters more than usual. A lot of the specific numbers floating around online right now, exact burial depths, exact uranium, stockpile locations, exact timelines for when a strike might happen, are estimates from satellite image analysis and unnamed sources, not confirmed operational facts. And with zero IAEA access to the site, there is no independent ground truth to check any of it against. Serious outlets and analysts are consistent on the big picture. This site is deep, deeper than Fordo, and truly hard for even the best conventional weapon to guarantee destroying. But the more specific a claim gets, an exact number of feet, an exact date, an exact list of what is stored inside, the more careful you should be until it is independently backed up by more than one source. That is true of almost any story involving hardened, classified military targeting, and this one is no different. If anything, it is a textbook example of that, since almost every figure in this video ultimately comes from reading satellite photos rather than anyone actually having eyes inside that mountain. And interpretation, no matter how careful or how expert, is still one step removed from confirmed fact. So where does that leave us right now, today? The United States has already shown twice that its most powerful bunker buster works exactly as designed against deeply buried Iranian targets, first at Fordo and Natanz last year, then against an underground IRGC headquarters near Tehran earlier this spring. Both of those were real successes by most available reporting, and there is no real doubt that they worked. Pickaxe Mountain is something different. It is a target that several independent experts believe may sit beyond what the same weapon can reliably defeat. It has been publicly named as a possible target at a moment when diplomatic pressure and military pressure are both being used at the same time in a war that has already gone on much longer than most people expected back in February. Whether this ends in a strike, a negotiated settlement, or a long standoff where neither side fully commits is honestly one of the most important open questions in this entire war right now. And it is one I will be tracking closely as more information comes out, because whichever way it goes is going to tell us a lot about how the rest of this conflict plays out from here. If you are trying to follow this yourself going forward, here is what I would actually watch for. Keep an eye on flight tracking data out of Whiteman Air Force Base specifically, because any real mission against Pickaxe Mountain is going to require B-2 activity that is very hard to completely hide. Tanker orbits and long-endurance flight patterns tend to show up before an actual strike, sometimes hours before any official confirmation. Watch satellite image updates from groups like the Institute for Science and International Security, which has been tracking construction at this site for years and usually publishes quickly when something changes, whether that is new digging, new hardening, or the kind of sudden equipment pullback that sometimes signals a site is being prepared for something, and watch whether Iran makes any diplomatic move at all in the coming days. Because if this public naming of the target really is meant as pressure instead of a real operational plan, a move back toward the negotiating table would be the clearest sign that the pressure worked exactly the way it was meant to. And honestly, that would probably be the outcome most people on every side of this should be hoping for. Alright, 3 quick things before you go, because I want you to actually get something from this beyond just watching, and each one takes about 5 seconds. First, if breakdowns like this, really walking through the engineering and the strategy behind a story instead of just reacting to a scary headline, are useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications right now before you move to the next video, because this specific story is still developing and I do not want you to miss it when it does. This is exactly the kind of thing that could break wide open with almost no warning. Second, leave a comment right now before you forget, and tell me whether you think a strike on Pickaxe Mountain actually happens in the next few weeks, or whether this ends up being solved through diplomacy instead. I read every single one of these, and I am genuinely curious where you land on it, and it helps me figure out what to dig into next. And third, if this is the first video you have watched on this specific war, go watch the breakdown covering how the GBU-57 and its smaller siblings have actually been used across this whole conflict from the very beginning. It will give you the full picture that makes everything in this video make even more sense. The two really work best when you watch them back to back. Thanks for staying with me through this one. It is a truly complicated story, and I think it is exactly the kind of story that is worth taking the time to really understand instead of just skimming a headline about it. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.